Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a great week. I hope you survived the midterm exam and are now ready to move on to the rest of the text in this course. The stories in our course get, I would say, maybe more interesting in some sense, maybe more complicated. And I would say our jobs as interpreters becomes even more difficult as we move through the rest of these texts. So this week we have the longest story in Judges, which is the story of Samson. And if you are familiar at all with any story in the book of Judges, you are probably familiar with the story of Samson. He's probably, I don't know, the most well known, as I mentioned, but he's probably also the most open to interpretation story, however you want to categorize that, the most ambivalent character in the book of Judges. And so he's often a popular topic for papers in this course just because it seems like nothing about Samson is cut and dry. There's nothing obvious, and there's always interesting new things to say about Samson. So, in general, are we supposed to understand him as a great hero? Is he Israel's version of the Greek Hercules or the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh? Somebody that is very strong and goes around doing crazy feats of strength to impress us. So that's one way to read him. Another way might be to classify him as a sort of tragic buffoon, somebody that doesn't know his own strength, somebody that is defeated by a woman, sort of here again. So we'll think about our gender criticism section from earlier in this course. Some people have even argued, right, at least in papers before, that he is Israel's first suicide bomber, or the world's first suicide bomber. And of course, he doesn't have a bomb, but he does take out both himself and a bunch of Philistines and the Philistine shrine at the end of the story. So, what do we think about the morality of all that? Um, I've had people argue that Samson's parents are actually scared of him because of his strength. He orders his parents around. He says he sees a woman, he wants to marry her. He tells his parents, "Get her as a wife for me." So he doesn't seem to follow Israelite conventions of family systems or patriarchy like we might expect. Let's see. Many people have a lot of questions about his vows. So, does he consume alcohol in the story about his wedding? What about him touching dead animals, which violate the purity rules for a Nazarite? How are we supposed to understand that? Let's see. I've had people argue that Samson experiences a profound conversion experience after the incident with the jawbone, where he sits down at Lehi, an Israelite word that means jawbone, and he receives water from Yahweh coming out of a rock, and that he is kind of laying down his crazy killing weapon there, and maybe has a change of heart. I don't know what you might think about that, but I have had people claim that before. Or are we to think of him as a figure that started out as very heroic in the Israelite consciousness, but now with sort of the reflection of history, maybe the Israelites themselves, or at least the compiler of the Deuteronomistic history, has taken a more ambivalent view toward him. So we think about great heroes from our own past, like Washington and Jefferson, and now looking back on them, at least some people would say, well, yes, they were great leaders of the early United States, but they rose to power on the backs of slaves and their privilege as huge landowners. And while that wouldn't obliterate their contributions necessarily, we would now take a more nuanced view towards our own founding fathers, at least some would. And of course, that's a very controversial move in our country among some people. So maybe we're to think of Samuel as somebody that was a popular hero, but now looking back, maybe we can see that He isn't quite the hero that we made him out to be earlier on. I don't know, just an idea. So I tend to read Samson a little bit more critically because I think of him as part of this body of literature that tends to be critical. I can't think of any leader who is less Moses like or Deborah like than Samson. So he doesn't seem to do any judging, or at least not in the sense of judging people's disputes. He does a lot of killing, and the killing seems to be his form of judgment. Um, but yet, on the other hand, he does receive, as I mentioned, water from a rock, much like Moses did. So, what are we to think about that? Um, so, against my really critical reading here, I am once again very thankful for Ryan, who is an unabashed Samson fan. So, if you want to read the positive take on Samson, when you get to his book, I'm sure you will pick that up very easily. So maybe that helps give a little bit of balance to the course here. One interesting thing I noted going through the Samson story this time that I hadn't so much focused on in the past is the role of the various women in the story. I would say overall, the women seem to be smarter than the men in the story. At least Manoah's wife seems to be smarter than Manoah. Delilah, I don't know, is maybe smarter than Samson, or at least knows that she eventually will overtake Samson. We see Samson conquered by a woman, and we know from our section on gender criticism that this is not particularly something that you want to have happen to you as a man in Israelite culture. So again, there's all of these ambivalent experiences, but yet, sort of with all of the good or bad or things that we don't know what to do with, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson more times than I think any other judge in the book of Judges. So the Spirit of the Lord seems to be behind all of this, however you want to understand that. And also, this is the last judge where the Spirit of the Lord is involved. Now, it's not that Yahweh is completely absent from the rest of the text, but we don't see the Spirit of the Lord coming upon anybody after this point. So that to me seems fairly significant and something that we're supposed to pay attention to. So anyway, have a lot of fun with the story of Samson. I'm sure you'll all get into it. Everybody does, and I think it's a fantastic story to think about. A couple of comments about the reading. So this week we talk about structuralism, which I think is a great topic, and we have two really tough readings to get through, and I apologize that they are so dense. And I think sometimes when we have readings like this in seminary, graduate school, it's a good idea that if you start getting lost in the weeds, which even I do when I read somebody talking about Levi Strauss and sort of all the deep patterns that he sees in the text, is to step back and just try to understand what the theorists are trying to do. Maybe not understanding everything that they say, but what are they doing? And I think one thing that we could say they are doing is they are trying to look for patterns in the text. And maybe we don't always understand the patterns that they see. I think that's the tough part. But they are looking for patterns. And we ourselves are not beyond looking for patterns in the text. And so when you get to the course video, we'll talk about what those patterns mean or might mean and how they might be helpful. Also, I will talk just a little bit here about the Dundas reading. So Alan Dundas was a famous folklorist who taught at UC Berkeley before my time, before I went to school there. But there's even folklore about Alan Dundas at UC Berkeley. So he basically died while teaching a class. So talk about somebody who died with their boots on. So I that has always stuck with me, and I think is an interesting case. But To just so you know, he is not writing as a religious person. He is writing as a folklorist. So if you get bogged down in what he's trying to do in his text, um, take a look more specifically at the charts on page 188 and 189. And what he's done is he's compiled the works of three um, late 19th century, early 20th century authors, and where they examine and set out common elements in hero stories. And you'll notice one thing, first of all, that they haven't all identified the same elements, but a number of them are similar or somewhat similar. So I think that is, for what we're doing in this class, the important piece of the Dundas article. So just look at how he's compiled common elements, common structures in a hero story. So I think that's it about the reading. If you don't get a lot out of that, don't be too discouraged. If you do get a lot out of that, fantastic. But we're going to think about and talk about structuralism this week. So your question for this week is very open because Samson is so very open. So I'm just going to leave my question as, what did you think of the Samson story? What did you think of the character of Samson? So write about that, anything you like, and hope you have a fantastic week. And hang in there. We're getting kind of on the downhill slide of Judges, and you all are doing a really great job of looking closely at these stories, asking fantastic questions. So keep up the great work. Don't lose hope now. We're almost there. So talk to you soon. Take care. Bye bye.